Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards Ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson, and I'm joined by co-host Terry Robinson on Tomes of Magic. Today, we are going to tell you about a whole lot of secrets, but before we do that, Terry, I guess I'm going to open it up for announcements, and usually Terry has the best announcements, but today I'm pretty pleased about one that I've got. I have been busy online, and I was able to speak with one of the four original creators of the first rulebook for Mage back in 1993. Got a chance to bounce some questions off of him. He gave me some interesting answers, and I'm just really pleased as punch about that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now. We're going to start off today's episode. But in the future, I'm going to be using that material in some future episodes, so I'm just glad that I'm getting up one dot in networking on my own personal character sheet there. Terry, do you have any announcements for us?
I guess the only announcement is by the time we do our next episode, you and I may have given each other a high five in meat space. I am attending my first LARP, so anyone who is a listener that is attending the Mage Noir LARP, it was lovely to meet you, / I'll get you next time, / I'm so sorry for what I did. That I figure that should cover the full range of things that are happening there. I am a hermetic with access to entropy, so I have 2 one-sided coins, and that is the extent of, I think, the props that I'm going to do, and a somewhat period-appropriate tarot deck. And in the process of that, I went to my tailor. He's like, you have a flared-hipped brown pinstripe suit that you're asking me to tailor. He's like, you're going to wear this precisely once. I'm like, if I can help it. He's like, okay, I won't bother taking the shoulders in. That's $120. So I look forward to having met you. And that's my big announcement.
Yeah, Terry and I have known each other online for years, but this will be the first time that we meet in person. Hopefully we won't disappoint each other. We'll have to work on that. But it will be fun. He's coming down to Austin, Texas. We'll talk Mage. I have a feeling that's going to work its way into the conversation.
I like the idea that we're just so used to talking to each other with microphones. I'll have like a fake one on the table, and that we'll do it interview style. So like, Adam, what's your favorite part about living in Austin? Well, Terry. And it just kind of goes back and forth. And like we're ordering at a restaurant and be like, what do you fellas have? And I'm like, well, starting with my guest, I think we're going to have the pork chitlings. And people are going to
I could totally see that.
You're like, okay, that's what a marauder looks like. So that's all for me.
Definitely. Well, today we're looking at Book of Secrets, and if you don't count the quick start, this is the third book for Mage 20. It clocks in at 299 pages of content. It was put out in 2017, developed and written by Satiros Phil Bricado. I think I'm ready for a walkthrough. Terry, what do you got?
The Prelude, which is not actually labeled a prelude, which is one of the few times that this happened in Mage, is entitled The Secrets Game. And it's Leanne Milner torturing a guy. I really have nothing to add, but I'm like, oh, this got it was kind of like an inverse of remarkably similar, to the fiction that opened up the 1E Virtual Adepts. The number of Mage books that open with torture is higher than I would anticipate. But here we are, and hopefully as we go through the text, we'll get an explanation of why it started that way.
Yeah, I wish I had some sort of insightful comment about the nature of the opening fiction, but I was the same thing. It's like, well, I think she's torturing that guy. Okay, let's get through this.
As an addition, the opening fiction in Mage 20 is often violent and stabby. The introduction is entitled The Wizard's Annex, and it says, hey, the original version of the rulebook was going to be 650,000 words. We attempted to get that produced, but it was banned in Europe as a weapon, so we had to slim it down. So hey, here's the overflow book. And this book is almost 300 pages. That would have been nearly 1,000 pages of core rulebook.
When he says almost 300, he means 299.
Yeah.
So it's like,
yeah, it's 301 if you include the index and everything. Chapter 1 is entitled Heroic Traits. And I'm just trying to conceal my excitement because we get more secondary abilities in this chapter. Oh, man. It starts off with a bunch of archetypes. Archetypes are the term for the attributes and descriptors that populate your name and demeanor. And again, one of the things that is unique in Mage 20th compared to, I think, all the other 20th anniversary editions is they give you a strength and a weakness. And a lot of these are kind of variants on previous things. It is hard to tell the difference between the artist and the entertainer, conformist and the follower, the visionary and the architect. They all have slight variants on each other. And this kind of got me thinking. I feel as if there is one of the recurring themes I felt in this book is this book has a lot of things that feel midway between how Mage traditionally does things and newer ways that it just hasn't figured out yet. And the archetype kind of leans in that direction, where it seems like one of those things where you could pick your strength, you could pick your weakness and the thing based on those that would recover your willpower. And this just gives you a bunch more ways to do that. The next section we get are secondary abilities. One of my personal rules is I try to avoid sarcasm unless it's going to be an enthusiastic kind of sarcasm, and I literally screamed. So that's kind of the apex of it. So what I think this section is actually very good at is it gives you a bunch of abilities that say, hey, if your chronicle is focused on this particular thing, you may want to add it. Ideally, since this is kind of like the advanced rulebook, I would love it if the character sheet listed in the back here maybe cut out one ability, talent, and knowledge and left it as a blank space that the storyteller could say, in this game, negotiation is important. I think my favorite specialization for cooking, seduction via food. So I'm glad that exists. For instance, if you have a game about chantry politics, you may want to nix two things and add negotiation and diplomacy. A lot of these do feel kind of redundant. There's a fair amount of overlay, and that may just be a flavor thing where one character has negotiating and another character has networking, and they both kind of get to the same place. One of the things, though, that is kind of introduced are abilities that have a specific subsystem. An example of an ability with a specific subsystem to me would be like soak and stamina. It's a little stamina subsystem kind of that lets you do a thing. For instance, with fast draw, you have the ability to make a particular roll to get initiative and allow you to fire first and add to your initiative on the first turn. Some of these abilities are also geared towards being things that could diegetically be used to improve your magic. To me, a lot of these felt like a good way of adding attribute plus a different ability to aid in a magic roll. Because otherwise, one of the things I see when people are talking about Mage a lot is attribute plus ability. Intelligence plus occult. Well, if intelligent plus occult works on everything in your paradigm, you've essentially made intelligence and occult another power stat. So one of the ways of preventing that from happening is requiring a bunch more specialization, which is why we have esoterica and hyperscience that kind of came out. For instance, hypnotism includes a subsystem that lets you make mind magic easier or induce a command in someone. Microgravity operations puts an upper limit on your ability to use physical stats in zero gravity or microgravity environment. Psychology lets you help deal with neuroses. Some of the allocations don't quite make sense. Power broker is a knowledge, whereas networking is a skill and negotiating is a talent. Bah. And then there's some divisions that just kind of are flavorful, but I don't know how useful. For instance, power broking and propaganda are kind of suggested as being something that you do in downtime, where maybe networking is something that is more active. Yeah, what did you think about the secondaries and archetypes?
When I looked through the archetypes, I saw stuff that was so similar to what was in the Mage 20 core rulebook that for me it was not helpful. I recognized that these were the very same archetypes that we saw in previous editions of the game, so I guess it was kind of fun to see them again since I was so familiar with them. But when it came to secondary, you could say abilities, I think of them as skills, the three types of skills of World of Darkness games. I didn't find this very helpful. After having read 3 Mage 20 books now, I'm getting very used to the book telling me there's this old thing, you might find it interesting. If you want to see it, go look in this previous edition book and you'll find it. And I was fine with that. And in the Mage 20 core rulebook, they had this rules innovation where you can have, I think they call it skilled craftsman, you can have multiple specializations on the same skill. So that's how you can get stone lore fit into esoterica. And I thought, well, that's a great idea. I guess they say it's optional in the book, but it's a great idea. Why would I not use that? And so here I come through and it's like, it says at the beginning of the skills in this book, here are all those old skills so you can see them again. And then it lists them all out, pages and pages of them. It's like, look, the rules innovation make this unnecessary. And why didn't you just say, go look in this old book to find them? I got to say, no, thank you.
The next section, if you were not done with a big hearty helping of things that existed in previous editions, we get merits and flaws. And I have feelings. There are 243 merits and flaws in M20 so far. It has an aside about how adversarial backgrounds used to exist, and M20 got rid of them and just turned them all into flaws. Sure. Adversarial backgrounds were the idea that you could have a negative background. For instance, instead of having resources, you could have the adversarial background of debt, and it gave a way for that to come into consideration. It makes sense narratively to turn those into flaws in a lot of cases because it may not be natural to a storyteller to say, oh, you have to roll plus debt or minus debt. Like, it was not necessarily clear how that came into the story. One of the things that kept bothering me was there were a whole bunch of merits that gave you -2 difficulty while attempting something and other ones that gave you +2 dice. And it was not clear to me when you used one and when you used the other. We have a bunch of cases where merits and flaws were kind of conglomerated together. For instance, we got the flaw of impediment, which took a whole bunch of different physical impediments, how you may have difficulty negotiating the physical world or how people respond to that, and kind of just made it one thing. So deaf, blind, lame, left-handed, or whatever, were all collapsed into a single thing of varying size with some recommendations on how to implement it. There were some in here that I thought were just pretty great. Daredevil adds 3 dice to non-combat, non-magic rolls that involves acts of incomprehensible stupidity. I'm glad it exists. I don't know if I want a player to take it, but some of these are just darn fun and pretty flavorful. A lot of these also specifically say that the 1 and 2 point merits that reduce difficulties by 2 apply to attribute plus ability rolls to inform magic rolls. So if you are a computer whiz or you're exceptionally lithe or something, that will modify the roll that goes into magic, and that seems pretty great. But in a lot of cases, we wind up in weird spaces. For instance, expert driver in most cases is better than just taking 2 additional dots of drive. So it seemed to me that a lot of these should have like maybe an ability requirement first, where it's like, to be an expert driver, you need to be an expert in drive. A bunch of other ones had a problem where they did not scale well. For instance, Iron Will seems dramatically better than Code of Honor, and it only costs 1 point more. A bunch of them were modifications to how your character perceives and interacts with magic. For instance, Technocy and Scientific Mystic costs a bunch of points and gives you access to an additional practice at no extra cost, but Mage doesn't have a cost to additional practices. And when we get to the practice section in this book, it specifically says you only have 1 practice, which is yours, but it is made up of a bunch of other practices. So it is not obvious to me why this would be of mechanical benefit to you or why you would want to do it. There were a few where the numbers seemed off. Hero worship, for instance, I think the difficulties were kind of backwards. But what it did kind of introduce was merits or flaws as a kind of foundation for a new mechanic or set of mechanics that you may want to have. I think it may be reasonable in game that if a character had something terrible happen to them, they are allowed to pick up the flaw of vengeful. They get 3 experience for it or 2 experience for it. That is now on their character sheet. It acts as a condition, and they can later choose to resolve that with the story or just buy it off with XP. So to me, I think a lot of these are actually kind of interesting either for NPCs as a way of creating short narrative reminders to yourself and not necessarily for players, or as kind of a condition that a player takes on because, oh, they're now sleeping with the enemy or they're a cat's paw or they're in some way compromised. And to me, that should come with experience. A bunch of them are just strictly narrative and don't really have rules. Sanctity doesn't give any rules. The balance is kind of closer. In previous editions, a 1 point flaw was generally much worse than the benefit gained from a 1 point merit, and it felt to me at least that those two were closer. There were a bunch that indicated that they could stack, but materially seemed different. For instance, if you have a character who's dating someone from an opposing faction, and you're inclined towards helping them, it is not unreasonable that you could have Sleeping with the Enemy, Old Flame, Double Agent, Cat's Paw, and Narc, if you happen to be a traditionalist that's boinking a technocrat. So there weren't a lot of guidelines around that, so there were a lot that covered similar things. But just as a list of things that you could theoretically add to a game, I thought was kind of interesting. The other weird one was Crucial Component. That's called a focus. There were a bunch, though, that are fundamentally game-changing, which are kind of interesting. For instance, the Nephilim / Lamia merit, you get 7 points of quintessence back from every time you sleep. You are recognized as a member of the High Umbra. You can intimidate people. You can also be banished. A bunch of these just fundamentally change the game in a neat way. And I'd almost want like a little asterisk that said, hey, this fundamentally changes the game that you are playing. Also, the breakup between something being physical, mental, social, and supernatural was kind of arbitrary. It did do a thing that Adam and I mentioned before that I'm not super fond of, where in the entry for phylactery, it goes out of its way to just say revised is wrong. And I'm sorry, in revised was right. In M20, M20 is right. It's like telling someone they're spelling their name wrong. They get to pick. But otherwise, this was a big section, had a lot in it, some really cool stuff, some probably improved balance issues, gives me a lot of ideas. To me, I think the best thing a storyteller can take out of this is actually think for NPCs. And I think it would be a big lift to say, hey, players, I'm going to pare down a list and you can take from that. I'm not sure of a better way of dealing with it because, again, there's 243 of these. So storytellers, if you're going to introduce it, I would try and come up with some way to more gracefully present it. Like, for instance, if someone were to say something like, hey, is there a power outside of the normal powers of a mage that you think your character would be narratively appropriate? Or alternatively, what do you consider to be the web of connections that your character has? Or any of those particularly beneficial or particularly a problem? And then maybe work backwards to try and figure out if there's a merit or flaw that would allow you to embody that. What did you think about the merits and flaws, Adam?
We have had very similar discussions to this in the past. Terry does have a lot of good, insightful statements about merits and flaws. I feel a little bit differently because I've enjoyed having them as a part of my games in the past so much. I actually like putting a list of merits and flaws in front of the players, and I've had some interesting picks and so a lot of fun during game sessions have come out of merits and flaws. So I tend to look on them favorably. When it comes to this list, I really like how some merits and flaws were consolidated here. Not just the adversarial backgrounds being turned into flaws, which I totally agree with. When I was reading through Revised Edition, I didn't like adversarial flaws. I thought this is just the wrong way to go about accomplishing what you want to accomplish here. And so turning them into flaws, I think is great. But not only that, but there were also previous editions where they took two merits and said, yeah, these are really similar. We're just going to consolidate them and give it a new name. It's like, yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that is a good idea. Glad to see that happening. However, I got to agree with there are too many merits and flaws here. In the past, I've put a list in front of my players and we had some fun during character creation. This is just too long. Terry said it's a heavy list to ask storytellers to compile their own list of merits and flaws. I have to agree with that, but on the other hand, from my point of view, I think it would be worth it. I would like to do that. I would like to go through the merits and flaws, and especially because all through Revised Edition, there were a lot of books that had additional merits and flaws. I mean, a lot. They're all over Revised Edition. And some of them were nothing interesting, but some of them were interesting. And so I would actually like to put together a list of merits and flaws for my players. And there would be a lot in this book that I would just knock out. For example, there's a 3-point flaw called bigot. I mean, can you imagine a player sitting down at your table, looks over the list, and he says, ooh, yeah, bigot. See, my character's a racist. Now I'm going to sit at your game table every game session, and I'm going to say racist stuff. And as a storyteller, I'm like, no, you're not. That's off the list. Have a nice day.
Yeah.
There's others here that are, I think, too much overlap or repetitive or just not interesting. And so I would pare down the list, add a few from previous editions, and then put that in front of my players. And I would enjoy that. Let me call attention to one thing here. Previous 3 editions, there was a merit called crack driver, which meant you were really, exceptionally good at driving motor vehicles.
Driving on crack.
Yeah, they renamed it here to expert driver, and let me just say, thank you. I am not even being cynical here. I am no sarcasm at all. I am serious. I'm so glad they renamed that. I cannot count how much time I have lost at game tables when players are starting their character creation. One of them says, hey, crack driver, I'm going to go deliver some crack in the middle of the night. And all the other players start laughing about it. And as a storyteller, I'm like, can we get back to character creation, please? That would just be great. Page 59, we've got this flaw blacklisted, and it says one mage is having trouble with the law, and so all the other mages are going to treat them badly. It's like, okay, look, I've been a mage fan for some time, and I know that technocracy twists things to make mages look bad when they didn't do anything wrong. And so, from my point of view, the way I see it, a mage hears that another mage has trouble with the law, and it's like the first thing that comes to their mind is, oh, you had trouble with technocracy too, huh? Yeah, let me tell you about what they put on me. And so it's like, I have problems making this flaw work in the game. So I would have to think twice about that one. Page 77, we have Shattered Avatar. This is supposed to be a 5-point merit so that you can spend experience points in the future to raise your avatar background instead of one and done at character creation. And it costs 5 points. Why don't you just get a 5-point avatar at character creation? There's your one and done. So, the points don't quite work for that one. As Terry said, there are a number of merits and flaws here that don't have any rule systems behind them, or the point values don't quite add up. So, But okay, that was probably a lot more than you wanted to hear about merits and flaws. So let's go to chapter 2.
It's 243 of them, Adam. 243. Chapter 2 is entitled Expanded Rules and Options. And the first subheading is A Wealth of Options. We get a rule on how to knock people out and perform stunts and combine combat and magic. And it lists that sometimes you need to do it on separate turns, which ignores the thing in the core rulebook that says how to work with violence as a focus and a focus as being violence. But still, a lot of these are maneuvers from Tales of Magic Dark Adventure, which I think in general are fun. We get the Jackie Chan, which I think increases the number of maneuvers that is just a guy's name to 4. I'm a big fan of some of them. Alone in the Crowd, where you just like call out a dude and you do the thing where you point your eyes to them and everyone gets quiet and all the ninjas just dance menacingly around the circle and so on. In a bunch of cases it says, hey, here's how you can use magic to make this happen. Some of them are listed as requiring 2 actions, which doesn't make sense to me because it's like you punch a guy so hard, something dramatically interesting happens. Like there's one where you like punch a guy and then give him a wedgie or something like that. I'm like, that you could really do that whole thing in under 3 seconds. Like, I don't know why this takes 2 turns where you're like, okay, I punch him. Okay, everyone else go. I'm about to give this guy an atomic wedgie, but I want everyone to be able to shoot me first. And then you get to do it. And it's pretty liberal with the, hey, if you want to do this all at once, use time magic. A lot of these that say 2 to me should really be 1, or alternatively, if you're using magic and the maneuver, that's what you get to be cool with Mage. Very few of these to me are game breaking. They're more about, to me, genre emulation and look at the cool thing my Mage gets to do. Like if to clear out everyone else takes an action during which everyone's allowed to punch you, that's going to be a hard time magic-wise, and it's vastly more efficient to call upon the 10th sphere of gun. I would probably house rule some of these. Some of the systems are kind of weird. Like Parkour Master requires 3 dots of athletics, and the Parkour Specialty, which implies that you have at least 4 dots of athletics anyway. Pulling the wool involves rolling dexterity plus subterfuge, and I did not know that you could give someone a wedgie with subterfuge. This vastly expands the ability of that in my mind, and I'm totally fine with that. Ride the Wave allows you to absorb the impact of explosion with a stamina plus athletics roll against difficulty 9. It does not indicate that successes translate to the number of like points of damage that are absorbed. It just tells you how far you were thrown. So you're like, yeah, I'm doing this maneuver. Your nuke does nothing. Or alternatively, you still take all the damage and you're just projected even further away, which sounds like a bad thing. We get a neat little subsystem for Mexican standoff, which is when people are all pointing guns at each other. And it's kind of neat. It starts with a fixed difficulty. You have to make a willpower roll. You don't have to roll. You just go straight to rolling for damage, which makes sense if you literally have a gun at a guy's face. A lot of the maneuvers had pretty high difficulties and mandatory requirements of 3 dots of something. If you're running a highly cinematic game, you may want to nudge that. There's also a recommendation to be like, hey, violence has repercussions to it, and you may want to consider that. And this is a case where it says, hey, you may incur a flaw due to that, but most of these in this case don't necessarily translate into a system so much as now kind of an adjective that a character has. We get expanded rules for Curtamane or Curtamen or Curtainmane or however it's pronounced, because all of those are likely wrong. These are additional systems, so you still have to have M20 core and this open at the same time. I would kind of want everything to be in one place. The optional rules, so Curtamane is the wizard's duel where they summon spheres and they throw it at people, and you get to eat other people's quintessence, and there's a person in a box high above that gets to call balls and strikes. I don't know sports real well. And it gives a bunch of modifiers on how to do it and how to like psych a guy out. But this is also another case where it's like, you can spend a turn to do this, which will improve the thing you do next round by 1. And you're like, how about I just use my spheres to shoot him? And like, so a lot of them are just kind of senseless flourishes that don't really advance anything. We get rules for child mages and how that can be weird and uncomfortable. This is interesting because it's one of the few cases where it mentions a book, an RPG book for another line entirely, and it mentions World of Darkness Innocence, which is a book for Chronicles of Darkness that says this is how you run games for kids involving kids. It does do something interesting in that it suggests that there are 3 sources of child mages. There are powerful past life reincarnations, the innocents that embody a new avatar, which suggests that new avatars can be formed. The other one is people who are born awake. They also make an aside about like people who put their souls into children. And I'm like, that's creepy, but noted. And we get a bunch more systems. We get in-depth information on how hacking and information technology works, which your more than welcome to use if you care about these things. We get a bunch more restrictions on how hard it is to do magic through a computer. And it basically says, 3 dots is the limit you can do through regular hardware, maybe a quantum computer with 4, but a trinary deck is what is required for 5, which presumes that technocrats also have access to trinary computers, which may or may not be an assumption that you make. It gives you a system on how hacking will work in the digital web, which is kind of an interesting thing where it says, hey, the digital web kind of embodies the activity that you are doing. If you do particularly well on your initial hacking roll, you can have equipment that is useful throughout this digital web thing. And then it includes illustration on page 125, which I do not understand, that says 23 alpacas that are totally your BFF at the club, and has a picture of several alpacas. And I'm like, that's the one nonsensical art that I missed in M20. The next section we get rules on is resonance, which they label the physics of consequence. And I did not understand this section. It opens with
good. It's not just me.
Yeah, it opens with a thing that says the revised rules are contradictory. And I looked at the revised rules and I'm like, I don't think they are. And then I looked through this and it appeared to be contradictory. That word, I don't know if it means what you think it means. I would probably stick with the M20 core ruling that I think Adam described as people have resonance, places have synergies. Great! That I can run with. It does give a bunch of interesting ideas. And again, as I said before, a lot of these things are halfway between other things. This is like halfway to the Nimbus of Mage the Awakening. Gives a bunch of ideas on how to embody it, on what it looks like, on the nature that you could use to break it down. Like, for instance, it talks about how resonance is strictly internal until someone is doing magic, and then it brings up the idea of witch walks, which is how your resonance affects the outside world. So your resonance is described with signatures. Those are the actual descriptors, and depending on their level, that determines how easy it is for someone else to detect them. It also introduces an additional mechanic that says once per story, you can tap out on one of your signatures and just add that dice to an appropriate roll, which I thought was kind of a cool mechanic, that you could throw your back into it and be like, I'm using fiery. I'm using this to reheat a cup of coffee by screaming or something like that, and you get to add a bunch of dice to it. I'm very bad at coming up with these ideas on the fly. It says that resonance is something your character will naturally pick up and shed. It is no longer something that you can buy. It also mentions that each bit of resonance is going to have a flavor description and a signature, and those 4 flavors are devotional, elemental, stabilizing, and temperamental, which kind of map to the essences. They come in different forms. Devotional is based on a cause, belief, society, or ethic. Elemental reflects an affinity for creatures, spirits, or forces. Stabilizing shows calmness, structure, control, and self-integrity. And temperament is reflections of a dominant emotional state. And I think the system was a little bit complicated for my tastes. Somewhere between how it's presented in the core and here is probably where I would land on. It breaks it down into the description, which is the adjective, and the signature, which is the way it manifests. You crack mirrors in your presence, or things that were about to fall tend not to in your area, or the wind naturally calms down, or there are strange smells and behaviors in the world around you, maybe the constant smell of cherry blossoms. That was kind of interesting. The next section is called Wonders, Object of Enchantment, and it goes through all the wonders. Just in case you are curious what I mean by all the wonders, we get information on artifacts, charms, devices, fetishes, gadgets, grimoires, inventions, matrices, periapts, primers, principiae, relics, talisman, and trinkets. Yeah, and it goes through all of them. We don't get tomes. No tomes anymore. It is much more detailed crafting rules. Fundamentally, it breaks down into 4 steps. It makes liberal uses of minimum skills. It indicates that when making something, you want to use only the best materials and you have to have exacting craftsmanship. I would have liked a little bit more information about how that works. It indicates that artifacts, which are things that do not have their own arete value to them, just require a roll against difficulty 7 to activate. And this was kind of ambiguous to me. I wasn't sure how this was interpreted with things that had a dice pool. It indicates that you can recharge a periapt by just kind of destroying things with prime near it, and it will soak it up. And I thought that was pretty metal, but you need prime 1 to filter out the resonance of the thing you destroyed. It also brings up the idea of making living and virtual wonders, and that living wonders carry around permanent paradox equal to the points of the object within them. It makes frequent mentions to the point value versus the background cost value of it, and this I found a little bit confusing because it's one of those things where you build up a certain number of points and you can translate that into a background cost, but other things can add or subtract individual points. I found it difficult to keep track of a few of the things. Also, it doesn't really actively mention that making most of these things requires a point of willpower, except in the summary table, where it's like, oh, by the way, yeah, this totally costs a point of willpower. And you're like, oh, that would have been useful to say up front. It also says that the base difficulty is 8, 7 if you're in a sanctum, and no lower than this. And then later it gives us a list of modifiers that can bring it lower than that. Just as a note, as presented, the ability of you to botch while creating a wonder is pretty high. As an example, for just the quickening, which is the process whereby you invest an effect in it. It's for a 3-dot wonder, you would need 15 successes. If at a rete of 5 with a difficulty of 7, you still have a 30% chance of botching that process, which completely destroys it. If you did it at the difficulty 8, that raises it to 55 if you aren't in your sanctum. So this process really depends on taking liberal advantage of those negative modifiers. We then get a few more different kinds of devices and so on. And this does something that I mentioned before when we were talking about Forged by Dragon's Fire, where we get information that a talisman or a device or a wonder can give you a merit or flaw, but it doesn't say in the creation process how that would work. For instance, we get the Wolf Paw Amulet, which gives you the merit Berserker, and to me it is not obvious how you got that from a magical effect, because we don't have a magical effect that gives you Berserker, and there's a few other ones that kind of also say, hey, it comes with this side effect. Also, the benefits of not having a negative drawback are pretty high. So it kind of surprises me that a lot of these are like, oh, you get this, but you get this drawback. Buying off the drawbacks during creation don't seem to be too terribly hard. So it was a case where the two didn't quite match up. But if you want rules for everything, they're here. You might need to look through it once or twice. That was a lot of systems. What'd you think about them, Adam?
The beginning of chapter 2, we had the stunts. I actually liked the stunts. I saw them as like optional little things you can add to your game or not add to your game one by one, a la carte. So I would make the knockout blow no minimum successes. So it's like you don't have to have at least 3 successes or it's not going to happen. And I was thinking as I was reading through this, I think it would be nice to have a knockout specialty for brawler martial arts. If you got that specialty for your fighting skill, then every success you roll is one turn or one round that you can knock an opponent out. And that way, a small success can still give you, you can get a little something out of it. And the only people knocking out other people are the ones who actually, invested some skill and some ability into this. You don't just having happening again and again, because I really have to agree with the author here. We have been conditioned by so many years of so many movies, stories, etc. You hit the guy, you hit him in the stomach, you karate chop his neck or something, he instantly falls unconscious. And it really doesn't work that way in real life. Making it a specialty on top of a fighting skill, I think, makes it a little easier for me to bring it into my game, because I do like that cinematic quality, and a lot of players are going to expect to be able to do that. I just don't want it to be dirt simple for them. I like the expanded Kurdaman rules, but the special sphere effects is going a little too far for me. That's getting a little too crazy. Hard to understand how that adds a lot of value to the game. On page 116, we get into child mages, and I'm not against the idea of child mages in the game. I just think that the rules on this section really not so helpful for me. It's like no-brainers. It's like, well, obviously you would limit the strength, and obviously you would do this other thing. And there's a statement here about how all human beings are born awakened, and then they become unawakened, and then some of them later become reawakened, and that's why child mages have to have a higher arete score. And I just don't agree with that. Yeah, it makes me think of the chapter in Mary Poppins where these twins babies are like talking to each other about how they thoroughly understand everything in the world, and then at the end of the chapter they mature to the point where they forget it all, and it's like, it doesn't do anything for me, sorry. Page 122, the trinary computers have been upgraded. Now they're quinary computers. Now it's, instead of yes, no, maybe, it is yes, no, maybe, and, or, but they're still called trinary computers. Getting a little silly for me. I have to point you back to some previous episodes where Terry and I were talking about, well, why don't you just say mages have access to quantum computers? And this book specifically calls out quantum computers and says, yeah, they're a thing, but they're not as good as trinary. It's like, page 128, we're starting to get into resonance. I don't like this idea that says resonance is like a universal thing for everyone, and emotions of regular people have their own resonance. I like restricting resonance to sphere magic and mages and possibly some other kinds of stronger magic, like, blood magic of vampires or something. A group of 3 teenagers feel very, very emotional about their pet dog, and so the dog's going to have resonance. It's like, I'm sorry, I'm not doing that. It's not working for me. I think 11 pages of resonance rules is a bit much. In this section, it fully explains that synergy is the external energies of dynamism, entropy, or and stasis acting on a person, place, or object. This synergy subsection was a little confusing for me, and it basically tells us that synergy is an optional system on top of the resonance optional system, and so a mage can have both a resonance rating and a synergy rating, and that's getting a little too optional for me, a little too complicated. Synergy can get attached to places, maybe objects. It's the resonance of that one, and resonance is attached to mages, and they can interact with each other, when the stars cross. And so I think it's just easier to handle things that way. This section suggests having resonance and synergy giving a once per story bonus to a roll. I don't like to do it that way. I like having it a force in the game that makes, continually makes some things easier and some things harder. And it serves as, in a sense, a kind of metaphorical mirror that a mage holds up and says, oh, is this the effect I'm having on the world? Is this what I'm doing to myself? I'm really good at violent magic. I'm really bad at healing magic. Maybe it's time to think about that one. One thing that I was thinking about while reading this section is it seems natural to me that when mages in the world of darkness notice that resonance is making some things harder for them, that they would work at and fall back on traditional knowledge of their faction on how to reduce their resonance. It seems like resonance is something most mages would want to keep down because they don't want to limit their options in the future. Parts in Mage 20 where it just sort of assumes that, as time goes on, the resonance gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and a strong mage has strong resonance. It's like, well, I'm not really sure about that. So I don't think it's ridiculous to have a really old archmage who doesn't have strong resonance because he's been paying attention to that. Page 146, there's a Prime 1 effect that lets mages scrub resonance off of quintessence. At Prime 1? That seems too early to be able to do something that sophisticated to me. I'd raise that up to Prime 2 or 3. Page 148, Penny Dreadful has switched back to her nice 2nd edition self, and I'm so happy to hear that. When I think of mage signature characters that I would enjoy having lunch with, the 2nd edition Penny Dreadful is at the top of my list. However, the revised edition Penny Dreadful I would probably run and hide from. She was a different person. Page 150, I don't understand background costs of wonders. The wonder section was quite extensive. It went into a lot of detail. I guess I didn't have a problem so much with its systems because it was, in my eyes, rather similar to what I got in revised edition. Yes, there were some changes, but for the most part, I felt like we were doing the same sort of thing in the same sort of way. But when it talks about background costs of wonders, I saw conflicting examples. That confused me, and it would really help me if someone could sort of point to the place in the book where it says, this one's wrong, this one's right, this is how we do it. It's like, I gave some more specific wonders, and I liked on page 162 the EDR spirit bullets. These are basically technocracy-created bullets that will go into any gun. You can get an off-the-shelf, so to speak, gun and put the EDR bullet into it, and now you can shoot, Umbrood or ghosts or something. And not to make light of it, but this is actually something mages do in the world of darkness. And I thought it was not only a cool idea, but it makes sense to me that the technocracy would be able to produce these kinds of wonders, I guess a trinket in this case, that is so versatile. Any gun you buy from a gun store, you just stick this bullet into it and you can shoot spirits. And, I can see virtual adepts and Sons of Ether, being, wishing that they could do that. How do you do that? How do I get my faction to be able to do that? So that really fit for me. That was one of those nice moments of a very clever addition to the game. But okay, I'm ready for Chapter 3.
Chapter 3 is called Matters of Focus. And this explains how focus works. This is an attempt to clarify some of the things that were in the core rulebook that maybe weren't quite as clear as they should be. And kind of the key explanations that it provides here are which focus do you discard first? And the answer is the one you use the least. Those you most use are the ones that are the last you are going to get rid of. It indicates that focuses are influenced by appropriateness. We are given a bunch of examples that say, hey, this is how this person generally does this kind of magic. This is how this person does this kind of magic. We get an idea of what instruments you can use to act ahead of time, that you can bring together multiple focuses for a complicated or varied effect. And it said it'll probably be thematically appropriate, especially if you're doing an extended ritual, that for one phase of it, you're using one set of tools. Like if you're trying to bring your orphan-powered space laser online or something like that, focus, like your first part is you use the focus on to get the big door at the top of your lab open, so you have your grand opening, so there's a big knife switch that you do there, and then that opens, and then you switch to chemicals or something, and then you have the orphans coming. I don't know, but it gives an idea that as an effect goes on, the focuses you use may vary. Ultimately, you will only need to use one, but more than one may be appropriate. It says that you need to at least have one of the skills or associated abilities tied to a focus, which is something I have never enforced. It also mentions that technically every mage has one practice, and it is their practice. That practice can be made of sub-practices as you like. It also reiterated the fact that it's really hard to learn spheres from people who don't have the same paradigm as you, and is impossible to kind of do it on your own, where in previous editions it's like, you can do it, but it's slower. So it gives suggested times. I've never really got the importance of indicating learning times for a sphere as what have you, and to me it kind of makes the game feel like something where there's a lot more favor trading to be like, oh, I need to learn my fourth dot, which means I need to find an adept out there somewhere that I can learn from who's going to teach me for 4 months. It gives an opportunity for story, as it were, but that seems excessive to me. Then we get a bunch of characters, and I thought there was going to be a example of play, but it's a whole bunch of kind of half character sheets. And a lot of the paradigms are like before and after from Wheel of Fortune. Like, we have the paradigm of a world of gods and monsters, so we are meant to be wild, and so it's all good, have faith. And one of the characters, their paradigm is, in a world of gods and monsters, we are meant to be wild, so it's all good, have faith. I'm like, okay, that's one way to do it. So you can just kind of jam the paradigms together. We get a bunch of expanded paradigms, and this one actually I kind of liked because it explains some things that the core book didn't, where it says a paradigm needs to explain kind of how the world works. And a lot of them kind of failed because they didn't actually tell you where magic came from, or at least why a mage can do magic. And a bunch of these fix that. The aliens make us what we are. I thought that was going to be like a comment on how outsiders allow us to truly know ourselves. Nope, literally talking about aliens. And I'm like, okay, this is the mage. This is the mage I know and love, which is very similar to the next one, which is all power comes from the gods and ancient wisdom is the key. Again, just like the natures and demeanors, the archetypes, they were subtle variations on it. But in this case, I'm kind of fine with it because the associated practices frequently differed, and there would be some recommendations on flaws to go with it. We had a bunch of Gnostic things again. It mentions all the world is a stage and consciousness is the one true reality. There are a few that I wasn't quite sure how to do. A holographic reality, fine. The idea that we live in anti-de Sitter space, sure. We then get some expanded practices. And again, this is just kind of useful material that you may want to look into. I do wish, much like the merits and flaws kind of gave a summary at the end where it said, hey, this is just all the names, that we got kind of an updated list of just all of them. That way you could have them maybe with a few word descriptions just to update it, as well as some information on additional instruments, which I thought were fine. We get a few asides here or there. A bunch of these are kind of subsets or specializations of other ones. Like we get both like cannibalism and transgression. We get cybernetic implants, which is kind of already in a previous one. Internet activity as a thing. So some of them are just more specific or more general. Again, it's fine. One of the reminders they say is you need at least a certain number of instruments. You need at least 7, but you're more than welcome to take more. But whatever you pick, you should still have, you shed them at a rate that you still have 1 when you get to Arete 8. So what did you think about Chapter 3?
Starting off with the frequently asked questions and expanded information on instruments and focus, I finally understand the Mage 20 7-instrument setup. Player chooses 7 instruments with no thought of which spheres they go to. Each effect has an instrument assigned to it. And as you phase out instruments, then you look at your list of effects and which instrument is connected to it, and those are the effects you no longer have to use an instrument with. But they should still connect to your paradigm. It's like, why did I have to read 977 pages to finally get the straight scoop on that? That was a bit excessive. Okay, and on page 174, the first question in the frequently asked questions on that page, a bit of a difference in philosophy here. It's talking about how you should learn more about real-world beliefs about magic and systems of the occult to make your game better. It says, quote, by grounding your imaginative creations in authentic foundations, you'll bring an element of realism in your mage game that would be lacking otherwise, end quote. It's like, well, okay, but what if I don't want realism in my fantasy games? Why is it assumed an element of realism makes a fantasy game better? Examples in play, we get 6 sample characters, and I understand this had something to do with a Kickstarter involved with Mage 20, which I guess it's a lot of fun for people to see their sample characters given some art and a write-up, and it's used as an example of how paradigms can be combined. You don't have to pick just one off the list. You can pick 2 or 3, and as long as they make sense, then you can make something new out of that. And yeah, I agree, as long as they make sense. However, looking through these sample characters, there's a few on here that are just a nonsensical mashup of weird ideas. And it's like, so there. Page 188, we get the paradigm, aliens make us what we are. And can I just say, it wastes space to attack other paradigms in the description of a paradigm. You know, just going forward, can we keep that in mind? Because that was padded out to be much thicker than it really needed to be. Embrace the threshold is presented as a paradigm, and it basically says some amazing thing is going to happen in the future and it's going to change everything. And that's the paradigm. And I'm sorry, but that's not a paradigm. Everybody needs more than that. It's like, what's going to happen and how is it going to change everything? That would make it a paradigm. And I gotta say, a number of these paradigms are minor variations on ones I saw from the core book, and I really have to ask the question, do we need them? Perhaps a natural consequence of a list of paradigms is that list is going to get longer and longer. There are some new practices in here, such as cannibalism and transgression, and I've got to ask, where is this game going, and do I want to follow it there? I guess that's pretty edgy and cool, and okay, I'm glad that more options are offered to people who know how to use them well, but I'm not sure I know how to use those well, and I would probably have a discussion with a player who said, yeah, I would probably have a discussion with a player who said, yeah, my character does cannibalism, so yeah, I'm just going to come into your game with that. And I'd say, well, can we talk about that? I'm not sure about that one.
Maybe we can meet there. Maybe your meat-omancer needs to have a different build. My feeling for a bunch of those, because I had a similar response, especially also with some of the flaws where it's like everything is terrible for you all the time and you're always consumed by this thing and you can't do anything else. You're like, that's going to be fun in a group. My presumption is it's intended kind of like a DM's manual where these are things to give you ideas for NPCs, but that was my feeling. Where, yeah, some of these were pretty out there, especially the one that was like, oh yeah, you take things to extreme all the times and you are going to burn out immediately. And I'm like, yeah, not going to be at my table. Maybe it inspires an NPC. Who knows? Like,
oh, okay. NPC
hopefully.
aids for storytellers. I guess I can see that a little better, but let's just talk about this because I really need to know where you're actually trying to go with this one.
So chapter 4 is entitled Justice and Influence, and it is exactly what is on the tin. It goes through the factions in the Ascension conflict, and there's like, hey, this is the general idea how you roleplay this thing. This is how they deal with stuff. This is the things they think are no good. This is how they deal with people who do the not good things. We get the idea of hearing tribunals within the traditions, which are for internal affairs. You have a council tribunal, which addresses things between them. You can also request a block tribunal, which includes 3 members of every tradition and is incredibly formal. If you're bringing together 27 mages, it better be formal. Like, this is not a beach party unless... That would be a great thing to be like, oh no, I have to go to this block tribunal. Is that in the pleasure realm? Yeah, Balador. It's the only place we could book. I'm going to be there for a couple months. I have a lot of research to do. Don't wait up. It mentions that they use magic for evidence gathering, but tampering with evidence using magic is a high crime. And then it goes through the crimes. It goes through the low crimes, which are like being mean to someone or disrespectful or being lame, being lazy, lechery, which it broadly defines as bad touching things, kind of cowardice and vandalism. Be like those rapscallions who kept putting like their tags on the outside of Dewizatep or something. And then we get high crimes, including betrayal, endangerment, diabolism, oath breaking, murder violation, and major acts. And just to break the fourth wall for a moment, I tried to take all of my notes for this book using speech to text, and that was a poor choice because Diabolism was turned into Diabloism, which I assume are people who are quite fond of the Blizzard game Diablo, and it didn't interpret the comma, so breaking murder violation is just one thing in my notes where it's like, you've been caught breaking a murder violation. You're like, that, some machine learning algorithms spit that out. It also
sounds serious.
Yeah. The punishments, what it does is it both indicates what the punishment is and maybe how you can get out of it if you need to. You get the idea of parole where you're going to be watched for a bit. There could be a possibility of redemption. Talion, which my speech to text wrote down is Italians are a kind of eye for an eye method. And I'm like, that is not what that's supposed to mean. But Talion, the idea that the punishment should fit the crime, that you killed someone else's familiar, so they're going to kill your familiar, which seems remarkably harsh on the familiar, whereas reparation is giving someone something to make up the bad thing you did. Indenturement or servitude is another common one, which the Hermetics, the Kashiana, the Thanatoics use, where others are not comfortable with the idea of human servitude like that. Branding is where you mark someone as having committed a crime. And reproof is the scientific version of that, where you send a sternly worded letter to Paradigma saying that they were wrong, which is in no way differentiable from what normally happens, I imagine, in Paradigma. But yeah, you essentially, you get your thing retracted. You have to wear a sandwich board or something with a big letter A on it. You have shunning and ostracism, which is a formal ejection from the group. And then you have interdiction, which is where they throw you out and they charge you with a death sentence in absentia. A weird side note, it kind of indicated that Vormas and everyone else was tracked down and killed. It mentions that occasionally Gilgul is still used. It also includes a side note that the council, there was a little bit of a crisis where they're like, the Ascension warrior was an imposter, but not everyone believes it when Acrides came back, and now we have it listed in canon that Acrides was the one who revealed the Ascension warrior, and people were like, I don't know if Gilgul is as permanent as you want. And it also includes a note about Gilgul, which is the rite by which you shred an avatar to prevent that person from ever doing magic again. Destroying an avatar is more difficult than shredding a mortal soul. One thing M20 does is it really makes souls a thing, which Mage really hasn't had previously. And previously, the soul was very mysterious, and maybe the avatar was attached to it, but it's like, oh yeah, you can tear up a soul over a 3-day weekend, you and a bunch of your bros, if you really want to. Heck, we have apprentices do it all the time. Gilgul is where the big boys play. And you're like, I don't know if I'm comfortable with any of those ideas or implications. And it also mentions that Gilgul cannot be done on other night folk, but it mentions that Spirit 5 can disperse their supernatural essence for a few days. I don't know what that means, but that sounds pretty nutty. That's like, hey, you're not a vampire for 2 days, which sounds like they would turn into bones and ash. Or that to me is a thing. I do like the idea of casting that on a werewolf, and you just get a dog, and you just get a wolf, and a person. And at the end of...
and they have to live together for 2 days.
Exactly. It's a buddy cop thing. Kind of like earlier, it mentions that you can have circumspect avatar plus manifest avatar and make it your ally. So you can have a one-person buddy cop drama. Mage just keeps delivering. I love this stuff. It also indicates spheres of influence, which my speech to text took down as spears of influence. Top-notch technology. It mentions that the traditions are active in the realms of faith and religion, academia, business, government, to a lesser extent, some influence on pop culture. A lot of these, to me, should have been bulleted lists. I think one of my recurring themes in this book is a lot of the information given in paragraph form. I think one of the areas where the Mage authors really shine is when they're like, here's a bunch of things, here it is in a short little list. I love those, and I think that could have tightened up a bunch of these. It then goes on to the technocracy, and the thing that I find interesting is the transgressions that each group has also indicates to you what each group finds important. And the traditions emphasize responsibility and excellence, that they very much care about what you intended and that you were trying your hardest. Whereas the technocracy, their two watchwords are merit and mutuality. It says that at its best, the technocracy is an enlightened meritocracy. You are given vast power, but vast responsibility to match it. They are much more likely to allow the ends to justify the means, and your punishment is proportional to your degree of intentionality and failure. One of the things about the technocracy is, since everything is so heavily monitored and you are probably being brought up by your superior, you are presumed guilty. So you can find exculpatory evidence and so on. You have an advocate that helps, but your level of fairness and justice very much depends on your supervisor. You get an offender advocate who represents the person who committed the whatever, and they are there to see that fairness is done, as well as to uncover information. The degree of infraction is determined by the intent, as I had mentioned, whether it be neglect, an error, or something that was intentional. And the higher it is on that list, the harsher it is. The actual things that you can do wrong are abuse of office, collaboration or unsanctioned relationship with night folk, collateral impact while doing a mission, so you cause other bad things to happen, you're not tidy enough in one of the adventures that you're on, a dereliction of duty, your failure to do what you're supposed to do, dissent or insubordination, misuse of resources, reality deviance, subversion, which is not to be trifled with, unmutuality, which is more or less discrimination. One of the things this book reminds us of that gets very much reinforced in Technocracy Reloaded, whereas the traditions celebrate diversity, the technocracy punishes discrimination. In its view, picking on someone because of their ethnicity or physical characteristic is being unmutual. And besides, we don't care necessarily about diversity. We just need the best darn people. And if you're going to make any of this a problem, you're out. So there is no like celebration of you as a person. It is strictly tied to your ability to deliver. Generally, their crimes kind of mirror what the traditions do, but with much clearer boundaries. They mentioned that the problem with the technocracy, though, is that they are blind to their own failings. And I really thought this section gave a good explainer of how the technocracy operated that I don't feel that we got in the core book. It's one of those things that like a game tells you what's important by its XP system, a group tells you what's important by how it deals with people deviating with what their missions are. We get a whole list of punishments ranging from a formal rebuke to being decreed degree absolute, where you are broken down into your component parts and then like shot into space for research purposes or something like that. Okay, we have re-requisitioned your kidney, but I came here with this kidney. It's our kidney now, buddy. And it gets pretty metal. It also gives us the idea that your supervisor is so capable of giving you a dressing down that you lose willpower, which is just amazing. They're like, yeah, saying that your character is being chewed out is one thing, but forcing them to lose temporary willpower due to it is another. I'm like, oh yeah. Wow. I liked it as a system that said basically one of your punishments is you lose all your temporary willpower. It takes a while for it to come back, and I thought that was kind of interesting. It also mentions extra dimensional reassignment, where they send you somewhere in space you don't want to go, or amending society, where you have to reprogram your friends or family depending on the forms of your failure. And I thought that was pretty nuts. It gave us an extensive list of influences for the technocracy, and it kind of stated that the power the technocracy has is that they still very much have a handle over what innovations are being made in some way, shape, or form, and that they have non-trivial control over law enforcement, military actions, and to some extent government. But on the flip side, they are genuinely advancing the scientific frontier to sleepers by providing research development and exploration programs that are second to none. So gave a much more concrete sense of what the technocracy is doing that I don't feel that we had gotten in the core book. We then get information on the disparates, and this is the first information we kind of get on the Disparate Alliance. Each of the allies, which is kind of their term for members of the Disparate Alliance, east of the crafts that kind of contributed to it, was asked to submit 8 what are referred to as wise hearts, which are the core of the adjudication system. When a member of the alliance is accused of something from another member, 3 are drawn, and they cannot be from the offended or offending groups. Once the advocate are chosen, 8 representatives are chosen for each case who review evidence, of which 5 must agree for there to be a verdict. There is no appeals process. Each ally group has 3 executor generals, who are the swords, which are referred to as the swords of law, which are intended with delivering whatever punishment comes out the other end. We also have the protectorates. This is something new, and this is the idea that each group has a set of mortals that are deemed to be off limits to each other group within the Disparate Alliance. And this kind of gives you an interesting thing, and I'm just going to read off the list. Ali Batin, Sufi Muslims. Bata'a, African Americans who embrace voodoo creeds. Voodoo is in quotes, just to make that clear. Children of Knowledge, alchemists. Hollow Ones, artists. Kopoloi, Polynesians, Ngoma, African children and their families, Sisters of Hippolyta, female survivors of rape, trafficking, and domestic violence, Taftani, Zoroastrians, and the Yazidi, Templar Knights, Christians in the Holy Land, Wulong, Chinese immigrants to other regions. And this really gives you an idea of the area in which these groups are operating, or at least consider themselves to be politically active. For instance, the Ngoma, African children and their families, that's roughly 800 million people. If you assume that each child has at least, if the 400 million children in the African continent have at least one parent, you're talking about 800 million people. On the other end of the spectrum, there's about 15 million Sufi practitioners of Islam running around out there. There's something like 40 to 50 million people that are Chinese immigrants to other areas. And the Taftani with the Zoroastrians, that's between 1 and 200,000. And the Yazidi, which I don't believe has ever been mentioned, as being roughly 1 million. And if the Taftani are recruiting from the Yazidi, that is interesting because generally to me, I kind of view that as something like a monotheistic faith. Again, I am not an expert on it, but that really changes what the Taftani are in M20. Not saying that's a problem, but it's just something that we haven't seen before. We have an aside on what their punishments tend to look like. They mention that they still practice castration. Okay. As well as sometimes death being the best teacher. We get a list of their influences and how disparates tend to be more active within a specific cultural community. Some of them cross areas. For instance, the Hippolyta looking over victims of domestic violence. That can go across cultures. And most of their difficulties come when one area that they are covering kind of runs into another one. And there's sometimes a little bit of tension there. It also mentions that a number of these groups are fabulously wealthy. It mentions that the Ngoma are an absolute powerhouse in controlling Africa, which is, to me, something new. That level of power, like more or less controlling a continent, was kind of new. They list the Wulong as being fabulously wealthy as well, and additionally, the Templars. It also mentions that, oh, by the way, the Weavers are quite politically powerful in the Middle East, and the Children of Knowledge have alchemy, which is a great way to get money when you need it. And then they're like, the Ali Batin, who knows what they're hiding? Next section. We get a brief section on the Nefandi, which basically says, hey, don't be role-playing this. It suggests that even the Widderslancha, those who are born with an inverted avatar, choose to remain Nefandi. And this is kind of a new idea that we get that says, hey, if you're reincarnated and you have a twisted avatar, if you make it through your life without stepping through the calls again or rejoining it, something different may happen, which I'm perfectly fine as an idea. It just suggests that it is very rare, it is not necessarily canon, and it may be probably hard to do. It kind of ignores the structure within the Nefandi that was set up in Revised and just kind of replaces it with all the different groups that we got in M20. It mentions that their influence tends to focus on media manipulation and a bunch of cults and so on, which is, again, kind of what you get. To me, the interesting one is in the next section, the Among the Mad, which is on the Marauders. And it mentions, hey, they don't have a justice system. But to me, this chapter was really a way to say, how do I give you more information about the Marauders outside of what is in the core book? And we get a bunch of them. We get an update on the Umbral Underground, which is a group started by Stephen Warwick to get Umbrood across the gauntlet. This includes the Butcher Street Regulars and the Numpa Kachpa, who are a group of Native American marauders who just kind of traffic in acts of mass confusion. It can be zoo terrorism, elemental command, making a whole wall of marching cactuses. We get an update on the Baidai, which was the homicidal conflux, is just trying to thin the gauntlet and make reality more ductile by just killing as many people as possible. We get a new group called, or a renamed group, the God's Left Hand, which is focused on millennial acts of violence in the name that drawing from faith. We get the Citrine, kind of this dark cult within it, and it mentions the Citrine warriors dress like cybernetic Nazi Templars and behave like Satanists on crack. So I presume that they could be crack drivers. It also later mentions what the different groups look like when they snap. And one of the weirdest things is it says a Mad Nefandus becomes a gibbering Kalasha, which I don't know if that is to suggest that a Kalasha is both a marauder and a Nefandus. That was kind of ambiguous to me, but we get a bunch of information on marauders who may be out in the world. George Blank. We get an update on Robert Davenport, the Wild Ones, the Sleeping Lord, which is a new character. And it brings back the idea that we haven't really seen in a while that says that the marauders may be tied to the wild. One of the things that M20 does that I'm not a huge fan of, but I guess is okay, is it makes mention to the forces in Werewolf, like the Weaver, the Worm, and the Wild. I tend to prefer couching it in Mage terms and talking about entropy, dynamism, and stasis. Adam, what did you think about Chapter 4?
Chapter 4 was basically an expansion of Chapter 5 from the core book, but it was overflow, and I saw it as appropriate in an overflow book. The crimes and punishments for traditions and conventions I thought were well done. They were helpful. They give some structure and some good solid ideas for how to handle games where tradition mages will have conflicts with other tradition mages, or technocrats will have conflicts with other technocrats. And when talking about the Disparate Alliance, their crimes and punishments, I guess it was interesting to see how they were different from the traditions and the conventions. But honestly, the Mage 20 book said that the Disparate Alliance was just starting. And so to see this level of detail and to read about all the experiences they've had with crime and punishment in the Disparate Alliance, it didn't fit for me. And for me, the protected people groups for the Disparate Alliance, I thought it was interesting from the point of view of best of intentions that don't work out, practically. I really see it as the different groups in the Disparate Alliance saying, we really want to do some good in the world. We're going to take care of these groups of people, and it's going to be our legacy generations from now, and it's going to be great. But then in practice, they will run into all kinds of problems where they are prevented from doing things they want to do because they got to drop everything and go help the people they're supposed to be protecting. And also the people that they're protecting fight with other protected people. And now you have two Disparate Alliance groups that are kind of supposed to fight with each other for honor's sake, but they don't really want to fight with each other. And they both think, these people I'm protecting are just causing problems. And so I think some interesting stories in Mage can come out of that, of how the Disparate Alliance goes over the course of some years say, it was a good idea, but maybe we'll scale that one back. From that point of view, I liked seeing the protected people group. Now, when it comes to the influence sections for traditions, conventions, Disparate Alliance, I found a lot of stuff that was either obvious or just plain dull. It actually looked to me like an excuse for the author to, again, talk about the world today, about the real world. It just didn't offer anything for me. This was stuff that I could sort of figure out on my own. And there were some interesting bits in here that are kind of really grabbed my attention. For example, it says that the Al-Qaeda group, which is a real-world extremist religious group that causes a lot of problems, they lost their protected status. But Al-Qaeda is Sunni, and Sunni Muslims, they were never on the list of protected people. Those are Sufi Muslims who are on the protected list. So that was kind of odd. It says that the Templars want to start another crusade, and I was like, what? That sounds absolutely ridiculous. I cannot see how they would want to start another crusade. Also, it says that the Templars are wealthy and they've got fat bank accounts tucked away. And for me, it goes against the concept of the world of darkness version of the Templars. I mean, if you want to look at real world history, back in the Middle Ages, the real Templars did have access to a whole lot of money and made them an interesting group hundreds of years ago. But the whole idea of the Templars in the world of Mage is they lost all that in a huge conflagration, and they're never going to get it back. And now they're kind of on the run and laying low and doing the best they can with what they've got and sort of remembering those lost glory days. And so to now say, they got fat bank accounts, they got money whenever they wanted. It's like, for me, that just runs against the whole idea behind this Mage faction. I thought it was a terrible missed opportunity to talk about possible relationships between the Wulong Chinese disparate mages and the real-world criminal organizations called the Triads, which are Chinese organized crime groups that operate internationally in a lot of cases. That would have been fascinating to see how the Wulong influenced them or court their attention and what sort of trouble they've gotten into with that, but it just wasn't mentioned at all. So getting into the Nefandi section, there's long-winded advice about Nefandi player characters, and I just don't like the idea of Nefandi player characters, so it was like a sidebar that was like basically a whole page, and it's like, that just doesn't do anything for me. Nefandi player characters are going to do awful things, and I don't like role-playing game sessions about awful things. So page 242 implied a little too strongly for me that the outer horror kind of Nefandi, the Nefandi that serve big unknowable evil forces, beyond everything else out in the deep umbra, this is for immature and weak-minded people, and I don't think that's true, and I don't think that's a helpful thing to be saying in Mage books. You can just say, look, if you guys want to do that, there's some old books that'll help you do it, but why speak against people who want to do that? I don't see that as being helpful. Now, getting into the Marauders, I didn't really like the idea of having categories for Marauders. I don't think that's helpful. I think it goes against the idea of Marauders. It sort of implies that maybe storytellers shouldn't add their own new categories. They should work with the categories they've got. However, I did really like the examples of Marauders that were a part of each category. It's like, can we keep the examples but lose the categorizations? I think that would be more helpful. I don't see a lot of Marauder signature characters in the Mage books that really grab my attention and make me want to add this to my game. So I will call out on page 247, there's a Marauder named Witch House. That's a cool Marauder. I read that and I was like, okay, I would probably use this in my game. So I put that on my list of notes I'm keeping on one computer to the side here of cool marauders. Fascinating idea of the negative men, which is like a special group of marauders that instead of causing crazy problems, they negate the magic of other mages. I think this is an interesting idea, but I just don't see how it fits with the concept of marauders. I think it would be interesting both in terms of story potential and thematically to make them a separate group. The negative men are not, they don't fit into any of the categories we know. That would have been an awesome addition to Mage 20 to get a little meta plot in there, but you don't have to include it if you don't want to. So yeah, I like negative men, but not as marauders. I want them as a new group. There was a mention of the Loom of Fate marauders. There was actually a callback to that. I was like, whoa, that's so cool. I liked those guys. I never thought I would see them mentioned again in another Mage book, but here it is. It's like, hey, check out Loom of Fate. Cool marauders there. I was like, yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. One question on it. Did you feel that that most of the marauders seemed very powerful in terms of what they did in the world? I don't know if the book was trying to say, hey, masters are more likely to go marauder after they've experienced a lot of stuff, because a lot of them talked about like the extent to which they could warp the world around them. Like even the write-up for Robert Davenport, he's like, he's not that powerful. He only has spirit 5 and every other sphere at 3 or below. And I'm like, that seems pretty powerful in the grand scheme of things. I kind of felt like they should fill in maybe like what's a low-level marauder look like? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it would have been helpful to have some more low-level marauders. I did notice that they were quite powerful when I was going through there. I have to confess, I made an assumption about that and carried on without giving it too much more thought. My assumption is that the author intended to have a single marauder be an opponent for a cabal of mages. And so I assumed, this is just my assumption, but I assumed that asking a storyteller to handle multiple marauders might be difficult and confusing, and so it's simpler to use one marauder as an NPC villain at a time, and thus make them powerful so that they are a challenge to a small cabal of mages. So that's just out of my own head. Maybe there is something to say about more powerful mages are more likely to become marauders in the first place, but I didn't see it called out in the book. So I don't think the author was consciously trying to express that to the readers. But
that makes sense.
Those are my thoughts.
The rogues gallery idea, I guess, from like superhero comics, where if you have 5 heroes together against one bad guy, the bad guy has to be pretty powerful to justify 5 good guys going up against it. That makes sense. And with that, Chapter 5, to speak of many things. And in Chapter 5, of many things are spoken. This is a bit of a mix. It gives us some information about the production process. It's set up as a Q&A, and there's a little thing at the front, which I kind of appreciated, that was like, hey, if you don't like this, blame me. It's all my fault. If it doesn't piss you off, blame me anyway. And I thought that was like generous of the author to say in the little disclaimer that we got on page 254. It goes through a mix of questions saying, hey, why was M20 produced this way? And one of the questions was, why wasn't this 4 volumes? Why is it so big? Why is it so small? Why is it stuck in the 90s? Why did you change the thing that I loved about it being stuck in the 90s? Why are some things seemingly redundant? I thought it gave a bunch of interesting answers to that, in that it just said, hey, we had space limitations. Words are finite. Mage is a really big game. Like in the section where it says, why didn't you include the camps? That is, the groups within each tradition or technocratic methodology. And the author's just like, each one at a minimum would need 200 to 300 words. And for the Hermetics, you have 13 houses just by themselves. So this would have like quintupled the amount of space that we took for that, which makes sense. One of the key things it answers is, why did you spend the first 5 chapters on occasionally redundant setting stuff? And the author talks about how I wanted the first pass to be in world as if you are being narrated to by maybe an archmaster or an old wizard that kind of gives it to you within the voice of the world of darkness, whereas the later things are presented in a much more objective face. And I get that. I think that addresses my concern, because I really felt like that was redundant to have both. I would have much more preferred to have the objective thing, and the author says, hey, I wanted to separate out those 2 voices. It kind of answers a bunch of questions about why the technocracy was kind of elevated, and it's like, well, the problem with the technocracy being the bad guys was really just an artifact of first edition, and it took us a little bit to get through that, and now it was finally time to bring them to equal footing. Some of the answers are useful and wordy. Some of them are not useful and wordy. But on the whole, I found these surprisingly more informative than I anticipated. We get some questions answered about the meta plot and why certain things happened and certain things didn't. And then we get a section that kind of does a bunch of rules explainers. I appreciated some of these. For instance, it kind of reiterates a thing that I had internalized from the core rulebook that says whenever you're doing an effect, it's almost impossible to get an effect that does more damage than 2 times the number of successes you have. And it gives up the example of, can I use my control of matter to create steel spears out of mud that just pierce a guy and kill him? And the author's like, no, it's done as an attack. That's how you roll it. And which I appreciated. It clarified some other things like, can non-mages learn and employ dough? Yes, this is something I always kind of thought was the case, except for the things that is specifically called out sphere magic. It does give us rules for detecting an awakening, and it's like, oh, by the way, when someone awakens, it really glows in the other world. Also, it is their starting avatar rating, 10 minus that to detect someone awakening. And it's like, can I still use the rules for naming from Order of Hermes Revised? And it's like, yep, go nuts. Which... Go ahead. There were a bunch of things because the questions are written in a certain size font and the answers are in another. Frequently, the header took up significantly more space than the answer, which I thought was just kind of funny. We go through that. There's a bunch of things clarifying on damage and effects. I did not realize that if you use an attack roll to see if a magical effect lands, those successes do not roll over from the attack to the damage, which now makes it the case that frequently the 10th sphere gun is going to be a better usage unless you have a pretty high arete, because yeah, it's hard to get that many successes to beat out a shotgun. It clarifies a bunch of the sphere effects, which are useful. It gives you some advice on adjudicating. And then we get to the storytelling genre and mage section. This is the penultimate part, which gives you ideas on not necessarily genre, but how to modify a game to get the flavor that you want. It talks about the importance of knowing what your tropes are and genre emulation. And I personally, as more and more time goes on, I am less and less interested in a game doing genre emulation. That is something that is largely played out for me. One of the reasons I like about the old World of Darkness is they're games that are much more about theme and mood, more so necessarily than genre. You can have a game that straddles a bunch of different things and eschews trope at the same time, but it gives us a bunch of ideas on how to modify a genre to, say, make it more utopian, more dystopian, more gothic, more punk, more pagan, or what have you, and I thought that was interesting. It then gives us a walkthrough of different genres and what they are notable for, as well as some touchstones for it. This is more or less a set of definitions plus some literary inspirations. And the two most interesting ones here are magical realism, which I think Mage does a terrible job emulating because of the paradox system and so on. But as a genre I love. If I could ever do Satanic Verses or 100 Years of Solitude in Mage, I would love to. I don't think it's necessarily there, but it's like, hey, here's some recommendations on how to do that. And the other one that I thought was notable is the comedy satire section, where it says that comedy and horror, one, are the two cases where you're most likely to accidentally step on somebody's toes in terms of content they don't want to have in games, so make sure you know your lines and veils and so on. And it differentiates between comedy and mere silliness, and how silliness can often destroy a game if there's just too much of it. It's very, as I mentioned, it's very easy to step over the line. And Mage, as a game, wants the satire to be periodically comedic, but it often wants it to be barbed or scathing as opposed to it simply being slapstick. And I thought this did a good way of kind of putting a finer point on that. It talks about the importance of consent, especially when it talks about tales like romance, horror, tragedy, and comedy. And then it has a few personal essays at the end from the author. And I thought some of these did give a pretty keen view into the mind of the author, and the fact that they were just done as, this is what I'm thinking, I thought was kind of interesting. It felt like a conversation with the author, except for the part in the conversation where I didn't get to answer any questions, and brought up some other questions of, this is how sympathetic magic works, this is what transhumanism looks like, and then finally we get a bunch of suggested readings. And this is a pretty long, extended list of sources and influences with a particularly long music section, as well as just a long list of films. Chapter 5 overall, I thought was more informative than I thought it was going to be. In many cases, I do wish it had gotten to the point a little bit faster. I think the genre emulation stuff, I feel there are better ways of doing that. And again, in a lot of these discussions, I think a simple bulleted list would have worked out better. That's just me, but that brings us to the end of the book. What did you think about Chapter 5, Adam?
Chapter 5 starts out with this disclaimer on page 254, quote, "They are my words alone," end quote. And I'm sorry, that doesn't work for me. The person who wrote the first 3 books of Mage 20 and who is the developer of the game is going to say, well, these are just my words. It's like, this is not just some guy giving his opinion. This is the guy of the game saying, this is what I think. And so I think anybody reading Mage books is going to look at this and say, well, that's gospel. I got to stick to that. Mm-hmm. So it talks about how the Mage 20 material was decided to be split into 4 books. But then in another place it says the core rule book is supposed to be the one-stop shopping for someone who wanted to play Mage. And for me, that doesn't really come together. It's like I would not attempt to run Mage 20 unless I read the first 3 books. So I don't think one-stop shopping can really apply here. We have getting into the genres, gives us the tropes and the stereotypes, gives us some advice on how to do this right. And I gotta say, I really don't like being told to use only appropriate tropes or ones that aren't outdated. I just want the freedom to do what I want in my game. And if someone thinks it's outdated and I don't care. The reason that I read so many old books and old stories is they were written before the straitjacket of tropes and genres. The authors just did whatever they wanted in their stories. That's how I encourage mage storytellers to run their mage games. Don't worry about this trope or this genre or how to use it properly. Just do what you want and have fun. Why are we being encouraged to make our stories conform to these predefined paths? I think Mage itself is an interesting mix of genres, and I just want to explore that. Getting into the noir section, it's interesting. It lists a bunch of movies to try and learn about noir. None of those movies are the ones that defined the noir genre. Page 285 talks about romance and says, it's older than the romance novels you saw on the bookshelves in the 80s. It actually goes back to the 1700s and 1800s. Like, well, yes, but actually romances were the legends of the Middle Ages about knights rescuing kingdoms and fighting monsters and stuff. So romance goes back a lot, hundreds of years farther than the 1700s. Perhaps I'm just nitpicking there, but talks about essay towards the back, magic and the fascist urge, and it talks about how there are groups of people who are doing things they shouldn't be doing, and so they want to keep their practices secret, and then it compares this to mages, and it's like that comparison, I gotta say, on a fundamental level, that comparison does not work, because we're not talking about people doing bad things and wanting it covered up, or doing things about which they would be embarrassed and they want it covered up. We're talking about people who can throw fireballs and turn buildings upside down. They don't just want to keep that secret. They need to keep that secret, because if they didn't, paradox would kill them. Society as we know it would be torn in half. So this comparison was just very odd for me. There's an essay on page 290, taking other people's stuff, talking about how cultural appropriation should not be done in your games. It's like, well, okay, I agree with the spirit of this, but I really don't agree that there are individuals or a specific group of people that can claim ownership of a culture or art or ideas. I don't think that's pushing our discussions in a proper direction. At my gaming tables, I just allow my players to experiment with ideas, and I don't try to tell them about how to be proper or how to be respectful of large groups of people in the real world. I just tell them, look, just try what you like. If you're really being a jerk, if you're really being an ass, yeah, I will pull you aside and say, let's not do that. But generally speaking, I just allow people to experiment and see where things lead them. And I think that has led to a lot of very interesting game sessions. And that wraps up my thoughts on Chapter 5, which really was a mixed grab bag of things, as it said at the beginning. This is just a wild grab bag, and boy, was it.
Yeah. So what did you think about the book overall, Adam?
The humor in the book expands out the word count. It slows down reading. I just don't think it's helpful. I know I sound like a killjoy, but I think it's time to tone down the humor in these game books. It's just expanding the page count so much with things that are not helpful. As I keep saying again and again, RPG books are not for reading once cover to cover and then putting on the shelf and talking about them with your friends. They are for referring to constantly when you're running games or prepping for games. And so they're just different kinds of books.
Except if you are doing a podcast, which fundamentally goes through the process of reading through a book cover to cover and then talking with your friend about it. Please note that little asterisk that was silent.
I stand corrected.
Yeah. Generally, yes. Sorry.
But this book is supposed to be an overflow book, and we had that in second edition and third editions. For me, it's part overflow, and stuff like merits and flaws, resonance, computer rules. That's not really overflow for me. That's just like the rest of the core rule book. For some time, I've been hearing about how people who are working in or with Onyx Path, who are working on newer Mage 20 books, are often encouraged to look for ways to add plot hooks to their books. And for a while, I was scratching my head. It's like, why don't we always do that? Now it makes sense to me. After reading the first 3 books of Mage 20, it is antiseptically clean of plot hooks, as if a person was like trying to keep them out. And so now I understand this encouragement to writers. And so as I look at the other Mage 20 books on my shelf, it is kind of encouraging to me. It's like, oh, okay, the writers are being encouraged to put some more plot hooks in. And as a Mage fan, I will be glad to see that. After finishing this book, my feelings was, I know it's kind of weird, but I actually had the impression that I was like hanging around the author and like taking up his personal time for like a long time. It's like, I know that a lot of people enjoy the conversational tone of an author, as they walk through a RPG book. But for me, it was just a very odd feeling. I felt like when the book was done, it's like, okay, now I can give the author some personal space, because I think he's earned that by now. And so I don't think that's what the author intended, but it was just sort of a weird feeling for me. It's like, finally I can slide out of the booth at the coffee shop and say to the guy, look, I've taken up too much of your time. Why don't you get back to your drink now and your book? I know that a lot of people enjoy the conversational tone, but for me, I like a little bit more of a traditional approach to RPG books, where by the time I finish the book, I feel like, hey, I've got what I need to run this game, and I didn't spend a lot of time personally with one person getting to know them. It's not as much of a benefit for me. But that's my general thoughts on it. But Terry, you haven't told us your general thoughts on this one.
I have not. And my general thoughts are, I would also describe it as a mixed bag. There were large sections of it that were just more. For instance, we had the thing on additional natures and demeanors, additional archetypes, merits, and secondary abilities, which those are fine because you can just skip past them if you want to. The thing where I found it a little bit tricky is some of the things in here I found genuinely clarifying, like some of the information like you talked about, like on focuses and so on. And I'm like, oh man, how do we integrate that back into the core rulebook? I am struck with what made it in as a side system and what didn't. It's one of those things where, for instance, the camp information, I don't think you would need a full, complete write-up for that. That really feels like it could go in the 2 sentences category. Maybe I'm just taking advantage of the fact that I'm already familiar with the lore. And then I look at things like, okay, Resonance and Synergy got an 11-page write-up. And the idea was to come up with something that played well with everything that had been presented before. That's one of those cases where I would have been fine if they had just wiped the slate clean and say, this is now what Resonance is. And you don't need a diegetic explanation. You don't need an in-world explanation. Instead, it felt like a bunch of these systems were transitioning between what we traditionally had in the World of Darkness and maybe a place where the author wanted to take it. And there was a leap that couldn't quite happen there, either because it was too much of a departure from the system as it existed, or maybe it didn't get enough time to bake, or it's also possible that I'm just kind of reading into it. This book felt less sarcastic and jokey, at least, than the core book, which I appreciated, or at least that was my feeling of it. This book kind of felt half like it was addressing the storyteller, and when those kind of books happen in Mage continuity, they tend to be a little bit more of, let's give you the straight dope. It is one of those things where I don't think this is necessary for running Mage, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody who didn't have it suddenly hit a wall where they realized that they did need it, or an explanation that they really needed. They want to have that, go back into it. A lot of the advanced weapon techniques, to me, and the combat stunts, I think that is more interesting than maybe some of the detailed martial arts maneuvers that we got in the core. But at some point, a book has to say, this is what we think the core Mage experience is, and I may have a slightly different definition of that. I wish there were more quick references. For instance, we get the stunt maneuvers sheet, and it would have been great to have all of those brought together so you can at least say, hey, Book of Secrets contains all the charts and tables, and it combines everything across. I thought some of the art was quite good. I thought some of it not so great. The Templar on page 24 that is like, I have made a proton pack for Jesus. Yes. I have a fundamental question. I don't know who's on the cover. I don't know if it's Ioka Sophia. If so, she has now been on the cover of 2 books, but both of her hands seem to be functional, but also has a sword. So that's just kind of a thing I'm curious about. A bunch of the things I thought were a little bit on the wordy side. In some cases, though, I really thought that bore fruit. The examples, for instance, that were given in the flaws and merits, I think the word count there in a lot of cases was entirely justified. So that I get. So I'm kind of curious to see where the addition goes, I thought this was an acceptable addition, but it's a book trying to do a bunch of things at the same time, and it's hard for me to know off the top of my head when I need to go to this book. And that is something I find a little bit frustrating, but that's a problem that you're generally going to run into with overflow books. How do you know when something is overflow? But on the whole, it taught me a bunch that I thought was in the core but wasn't, and I thought that was in other books that wasn't there. The discipline section, I think, fleshed out the factions in a way that we hadn't gotten anywhere else, and I thought some of that stuff was absolutely great. What do we read next at? Yeah.
We are going to look at Gods and Monsters and Familiar Strangers and Errand Boys and that nice fellow across the street.
Nice.
So this was the first, let's see, this book has 3 new authors who, if I'm correct, had not written for Mage before this book. And so now they come in. And so now we get 4 authors writing about Mage instead of 1. And so it'll be interesting to see how that changes the tone of the book. Let's see. Did you have a particular quote from this book that stood out?
I do. From the Q&A section, the question is something like, are there clear lines marking where the Vidare ends and the periphery begins and where the underworld starts? And it says, no, except for the underworld. Everyone knows exactly where the underworld is. And I'm like, oh, that's useful. But then it later has a sentence that says, also, to be frank, the authors and designers have sometimes gotten confused by this stuff on occasion, the stuff referring to how the Umbra works. Although the Umbra is supposed to be ambiguous, not all of the confusion or contradictions has been intentional on our part. And I appreciate that level of humility. I would much prefer that to being like, revise is wrong! So as someone who is drawn to the Umbra and thinks it's absolutely fascinating, I am glad I am not the only one confused. And sometimes the only thing I want as a reader is for someone to pat me on the head and say, nope, this is hard. And that was my favorite line. There was also an interesting line on fart jokes that I thought was very well delivered under the comedy section. I will leave that as an exercise to the reader.
Definitely. Well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a review for Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in their searches. We would certainly appreciate that. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there, see the order in which they're delivered, and see the complete show notes that we prepare for you. Well, this episode is thanks to our executive producers. Terry, can you tell us the executive producers whom we can thank?
I'd be glad to. We have 5 oracles. That's almost more oracles than there are actual oracles. I'm concerned if the 2 ever converge. But I'd like to thank our executive producers, who are Oracle Buck Farmer, Oracle Christopher Phillips, Oracle Jay Widener, Oracle Mikhail, Oracle Regina O'Reilly, Alex, and additionally, Alex, Andrews S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze Herbert, Boo, Boogers, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsick, Elliot Osborne, Gargle Noir, George Lahr, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Josh H., Joshua Heath, Carl Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka-G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robot the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Conley, William Martin, W. Start, and Zach Rules. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you. We really do appreciate it. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. And until next time, truth till paradox, baby.
And while you're at your table and you say, I'm not entirely sure where that rule came from, just remember, it might just be the Book of Secrets. Go change reality. Bye.